Welcome back to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. This is a continuation of the series of video and audio conversations that we're calling After War, Before Peace. We started this series in November 2020, immediately following the signing of the document on cessation of hostilities, which was brokered, or one might possibly say imposed, by Russia. And it came 44 days after a military conflict that took thousands of lives, left thousands more injured, many for life. The fighting was initiated by Azerbaijan, as its top leadership now won't deny, and came after years of amassing top-grade military equipment, and it was aimed to reclaim territory, Karabakh, the Soviet administrative region known as the Nagorno Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, plus the 7 adjacent territories that had become the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh. Azerbaijan, then and now, insists that these territories fall within its sovereignty, according to international law. Armenians, for decades, have insisted that Karabakh itself is not, and has never been, a part of independent Azerbaijan. The 7 territories surrounding Karabakh were initially captured for security purposes, turned into a buffer zone, useful to exchange for status, a permanent internationally recognized status of independent of Azerbaijan, and eventually came to be seen as part of Karabakh itself. Today, those 7 territories are under Azerbaijani control, with the exception of 5 kilometers of Lachin, which in essence really is a corridor between Armenia and Karabakh. And there are Russian peacekeepers all along the perimeter of Karabakh. There are a large number of Armenian prisoners of war, unaccounted for, not returned. There are a large number of centuries-old Armenian cultural monuments already either defaced or in danger of destruction. And these are just a few of the dozens, no exaggeration, the dozens of outstanding problems that require negotiation and resolution. When the November 10th document was signed, the International Crisis Group said the deal, while welcome, falls short of a sustainable peace. And 2.5 months since have proven that to be very true. Massive fighting has stopped, but safe and secure is not how those who live their lives in that area describe their lives. So as a research institute within a university dedicated to Armenian studies, we are going to embark on a series of conversations that tackle these unresolved areas that I mentioned and many more. I would venture to say that regardless of how the war ended, whoever won, most of these same issues would still need to be discussed and resolved. Not all by any means, but many. After all, the beginning of a resolution of the conflict was going to involve several fundamental categories. The trick is in seeing that they are resolved wisely, humanely, with a long view in mind, in order to be seen as the prerequisites for peace. When I told some of our future participants that we are going to embark on these conversations and want to invite them, several of them said, please, let's not have these kumbaya conversations, because before that, there are many actual, technical, on-the-ground, political, social issues of security that must be identified and tackled. And that's what we intend to do with several scholars and practitioners. And just as we've done in the past, I will be joined by my colleague, Emil Sanamyan, a Caucasus analyst, one who is deeply knowledgeable in military, political, historic developments in the region, and is editor of the Institute's Focus on Karabakh portal on the Institute website, armenian.usc.edu. Welcome, Emil.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
Oh, couldn't do this without you. Emil, let's use this episode today to either make me out to be true or a liar, we'll see, to actually identify the various facets of this after war but before peace situation. Let's identify all the questions that still need answers. What's first?
Well, the first is to get a sense of what is this new status quo in Karabakh. What is the lay of the land? Because we've had a sea change in how the life takes place in Karabakh, in terms of security, in terms of economics, in terms of the future. Right now, the future horizon of Karabakh is limited by about 5 years, less than 5 years now. The document spells that out for the peacekeeping mission. And imagine if you were living in a place where you know that you have 5 years, and you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. Whether you're going to have your house, whether you're going to have your life, whether you'll be able to continue to raise your children. That kind of existence, is very precarious. On the other hand, there is great sense that people of Karabakh, Armenians of Karabakh, do cling to their land, do cling to their homeland. And you could see that as soon as the shooting had stopped, as soon as shelling had stopped, and as soon as there were some minimum guarantees of security, many of them returned to Karabakh.
So all of these social questions that you're raising, social security questions, are somewhat also a consequence of the political decisions that are going to be either negotiated or postponed. That is, up until this point, when we used to say status quo, we meant some sort of self-governance in Karabakh by the elected leadership of Karabakh. Today, it's really unclear what that political status quo is and whether there will even be the beginnings of a discussion of long-term status quo. Long-term status, I apologize, no quo. Quo is now. Long-term status, that is, self-determination is back on the table or not? Self-governance is back on the table or not?
Well, it was on the table because Armenians had control over certain territories that Azerbaijan wanted back. As of last iteration of Lavrov or Madrid principles, whatever you want to call them, the decision on status hinged on Armenian withdrawals from Kelbajar district and Lachin district, most of the Lachin district. And the notion was that since parties cannot agree to the status, there's going to be this indefinite internationally guaranteed security regime, but Armenians would keep Kelbajar and Lachin in that meantime and make the area contiguous to Armenia and relatively safe. Now that the Armenian side had lost all of those territories, had lost all of those, not just lost, but handed them over also as a result of November 10 agreement.
Especially those two territories, the ones that lie specifically between Armenia and Karabakh.
Right. And that's probably the most tragic aspect of this issue that is rarely discussed. Kelbajar, former Kelbajar, now former Karabakh, was home to Armenian refugees, primarily from Shalmyan district, from Khanlar district, Getashen, Shalmyan.
And what are Shalmyan and Getashen?
Yes, those are areas that were captured by Azerbaijan in the early 90s, north of Nagorno Karabakh autonomy, and depopulated with Armenians. So these people had settled in Karabakh in belief that this was going to be a permanent settlement, and they become refugees again. So similar situation occurred in Mardaker, similar situation in Hadrut as well. And Sushi, of course, was due to a lot of refugees from Sumgait and Baku.
So now we've delved into the topic itself, and this is an example of how complicated all of this is and how interrelated they all are, because one topic, one question that needs resolution is naturally going to lead us to others. But let's go down this list of others. So we agree that the status of Karabakh in all of its meanings should be our first, the first issue that we tackle as we restart this series. I would like to say, based on what you just said, either refugees or prisoners of war maybe should be our second episode. And prisoners of war are
Yeah, I mean, prisoners of war. You could say there are two categories of prisoners of war. There is the actual prisoners of war, whose number is unknown because the Armenian government would not reveal it, and the Azerbaijani government would not reveal it, and they don't treat these people as prisoners of war. Basically, there are three categories there you could think of. One is both military and civilians were captured during the fighting before November 9, and they were captured under different circumstances. Some of them were just in their homes, old elderly people that refused to leave. Some of them were taken to prison. Some of them were killed on the spot. So there was different kind of situations there. But then there you had people who were captured in the aftermath of the ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
Some people thought that it was safe, since the war ended, safe to travel back into Stepanakert, and they were stopped on the road and arrested. A number of people, mostly civilians. And also there was this group of Armenian servicemen mobilized to defend a particular area in Karabakh, which was taken over after the ceasefire in the middle of December, actually as the exchange of prisoners was happening. The initial exchange of prisoners was happening. So Armenia, in that exchange, basically returned all Azerbaijanis that it held. And as it was doing that, Azerbaijanis took more Armenian hostages and did not even return the ones that they still had from the war.
So you indicated part of...
To the day that process is continuing, people are being detained, if not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis in the last number of weeks.
So you indicated all of the aspects of that one topic already, the difference between civilian detainees and, I'm being polite, right? Detainees, civilians, and military personnel, hostages, international law and how it applies to them, why the numbers are not being shared by the Armenian government, why there is not any more specific conversation about their location, and at the end of the day, whether there is any competency in international platforms for to actually come to conclusions about what must be done for these prisoners of war under international law and actually enforce whatever decision these international organizations make. So all of that is going to be part of our conversation when we do talk about prisoners of war. What about the issue?
One thing I wanted to note is that during that exchange and prisoners exchange, and it was again something that most people did not notice, one of the people that Azerbaijan returned to Armenia was, I believe, an 80-year-old man who had been in detention in Azerbaijan for over 15 years. And there was no information about his detention. He was in prison without any kind of access to by Red Cross or anybody else. And that, unfortunately, could be the case with some of the people who've been detained this time around. They might basically spend most of their remaining lives in prison unless something fundamentally changes in Azerbaijan, which is hard to predict at this point.
Which is one of the things we'll get to later, I hope, in these discussions. But, and I keep cutting you off, I hope, as will be clear to everybody, not because all of these aren't important, but because we intend to devote entire episodes to each of these topics, including the really difficult topic of border demarcation and border communities, especially since some of this detainee situation is going to be, has been and is going to be the consequence of actually crossing borders, knowingly or unknowingly.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of the border has become much more dangerous and much more vague because yes, there is the Google Maps, but not every person in Armenia is literate in Google Maps, and the life that, say, people of Syunik have become used to is not one where they can observe Azerbaijani forces from their house in Kapan or some other places that have become basically in the vicinity of Azerbaijan, and it's very important that the fourth and the fifth largest towns in Armenia, which are Stepanakert and Kapan, have become basically border communities, and this will have a long-term detrimental effect to how safe people feel there, how the business operate there, etc. So this is a big blow to that area of Armenia, the south of Armenia.
What you've just said says a great deal about the nature of these 2.5 months since the cessation of hostilities. That is, if the environment had been different, if the return of prisoners had been less violent, if there was less evidence of torture and inhumane treatment of those detained, if the rhetoric was, the Azerbaijani rhetoric in this case, was less incendiary, still incendiary, even after the victory on the Azerbaijani side. If all of that was different, then the conversation about borders and border communities would more closely parallel that which is taking place in the international community, right? That how wonderful, now borders will be open and there will be traffic, trade, interaction, and all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can even, obviously, what we have between Armenia and Azerbaijan at this point, and particularly between Karabakh and Azerbaijan, is not a border per se. It's just, it's basically a fence that cannot be crossed. Sometimes it's an invisible fence. On the other side, you have no ability to operate. You cannot go across that border to purchase things or something. Even though now people are saying the Russian peacekeepers sort of traffic in food out of Stepanakert into Sushi, which is surrounded by Armenian forces. And the reality is that even in the border regimes that exist between some of the other countries, let's say let's take Azerbaijan, because that's the border regime we'll be dealing with. Say a border regime between Iran and Azerbaijan, border regime between Russia and Azerbaijan is different, but essentially, even with Turkey, Azerbaijan has been very closed as far as who can visit Azerbaijan, who can cross in what circumstances, etc. So what you should expect is a new line of closed borders, just closed borders that are passing much closer to Armenian communities and across some Armenian communities than it used to be. So you don't expect an open border, but do expect a more complicated situation in the south of Armenia.
And also, and we'll talk about this when we do the border demarcation, border communities episode, also a real understanding of how one draws a border to begin with, even in peacetime, let alone in this sort of no peace, no war situation. So if we continue with all of the other categories that we have in mind, let's talk about refugees, and talk about refugees in the context of returnees as well. You spoke about those in Kelbajar. There are also those who have left other parts of Karabakh proper. And then there's the issue of returnees, of Azerbaijani returnees to territories that used to be under Armenian control. That's going to be a complicated episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the big issue for Azerbaijan has been, other than the fact that loss of prestige with the loss of territory, but the refugee issue is a real issue in Azerbaijan. And at this point, essentially, they've returned almost all of the territories that used to be Azerbaijani populated. However, the challenge of actually moving people into this area and keeping them there will be real, because majority of the displaced people live in Baku area, basically Baku or Sumgait, and standards of life between Baku and even very near districts to Baku is very stark difference.
Let alone these
previously areas that have been basically depopulated for a long time and have no infrastructure. So it's going to take a long time. Of course, Azerbaijan being an authoritarian state, people can be compelled to move even if they don't want to move. This just has happened before. Some of the communities were kept together, even though people wanted to move out of them. But
but then you're really risking security issues, because it's bad enough to have been promised a home, 30 years later ostensibly given one, and now all of the frustrations will have to find new outlets.
Right.
So there's that episode. No, we ain't going into that anymore, because we'll not get to the others.
Let's continue going down the list, yes.
Let's go down the list. Roads and transport corridors. Now, these are two different kinds of issues, right? One of them is where roads don't exist and having to create them to create some sort of linkage either between Turkey and Azerbaijan or between parts of Armenia that used to go through territories that are now under Azerbaijani control. This is going to be a complex one. It's also a very heavily economic challenge.
Yeah. There are costs to rebuild the infrastructure, of course, but the immediate problem is maintaining the existing infrastructure. Be that the road between Goris and Stepanakert, which was built by the Armenian diaspora and currently is monitored by the Russian forces, but effectively has become part of Azerbaijan. Same with the road between Vardenis and Mardakert, which was built more recently. Those two roads now are in Azerbaijan. So, and Azerbaijan obviously is not interested in facilitating communication between Karabakh and Armenia. So how are they going to be maintained? Will Armenian construction crews be able to go in there safely to just repair roads, etc.? So that's, even those basic things have become a problem. You have an accident there, how are you going to adjudicate that? The police. I mean, it's there's that, and then there's the grandiose or semi-grandiose ideas of reopening railroads and whatnot. But I think they're down the road. Currently, there are a couple of more immediate concerns that they're there with the Russians trying to reopen the airport in Stepanakert. Azerbaijan is trying to reopen the road through Mehri.
Naturally. And we'll get to that as well. And of course, we'll get to that all-important topic of the transport corridor connection that Azerbaijan wants with Turkey. And that's going to be a whole other aspect of that discussion. The other topic that has to be talked about that kind of ties back to the very first topic that we listed, Karabakh and its status, is what does Karabakh life look like when it is either under Russian occupation or under the supervision of Russian peacekeepers? We could formulate that any way we want. But what does that mean? And is South Ossetia the example that we need to quickly look at?
Yeah, I think so, because if we look at the experience of Russian peacekeeping, well, Karabakh has its own experience, but there was a Soviet period of Russian peacekeeping with disarray that was increasing. More recent examples of Russian peacekeeping has been South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and particularly South Ossetia is very, even geographically similar, and in terms of population, similar to what the Karabakh situation is. That is one example that sort of gives some hope to Karabakh Armenians that at some later date, this peacekeeping will turn into Russian recognition of Nagorno Karabakh as a separate entity from Azerbaijan. But of course, reality is there. There is also the political reality of Russian-Georgian conflict that is not here, is not in this case with Russia and Azerbaijan. Not yet, anyway. It could change.
The issue of Karabakh and its future is also heavily dependent on demography. And that too is something that we're going to have to look at both in the context of this and the status. But let's go on. You've now mentioned Sushi a couple of times. And Sushi, yes, it is a city within Karabakh, but it has a special sort of significance. How are we going to look at that, the two sides?
For the past 100 years, sides look at it as a zero-sum kind of approach. In 1920, Armenians were kicked out of Sushi. The remaining ones, the few that stayed, were kicked out in 1988. In 1992, Azerbaijanis were kicked out of Sushi. And now, again, Armenians have been kicked out of Sushi in 2020. So I don't know how many other kicking outs will happen, but essentially, the notion of rebuilding some kind of coexistence inside Sushi, I think, is a naive one, particularly since it's really over time has become a much less significant town demographically and otherwise. Stepanakert is the main town of Karabakh for a long time, and that kind of reflects the way geographic factors influence that. Sushi is basically on top of a mountain.
On top of a mountain, it has its own access points. And even though you're thinking of a multi-ethnic cosmopolitan revival is out of the question, we're still going to have to look at that as we talk about it, because it's the only way to understand the significance of
Armenians
Sushi.
Armenians had tried to maintain some semblance of duality of Shushi's past. Ruben Vartanyan, I believe, funded, or others have funded rebuilding renovation of the mosque in Sushi, which will now be, I'm sure, appreciated by Azerbaijan. That's about it. It's just it's a place where monuments, Armenian churches, and the Azerbaijani mosques are in close proximity. There are a few places like that elsewhere.
And it's going to be, well, we'll see who we can find from on the ground who can actually address some of those. Armenia's military outlook. I don't even want to ask you how we're going to look at this, but we are going to look at it because obviously the question of security has not diminished with this document, and how Armenia will strategize, plan, delve into either armaments or restructuring of military personnel. This is something that's really going to have to be thought about, not just described, but also conceptualized, right? What is it we want to be? Is that the question Armenia is going to ask?
There are many questions that are going to be asked about military. Just a few months ago, there was another opinion poll where Armenians, again, identified military as the institution they the most trust, more than the church, more than any of the government officials, etc. Now, I think their trust had been substantially shattered. There is going to be a lot of questions. Will Armenia be able to rebuild its military and have a military that it used to have over the past 25 years, 30 years?
And that's the direction that we're going to have to go into, including looking at potential sales points that used to exist that may or may not exist any longer. That's going to be a tough one, but it's something that has to be discussed and planned for, even in this current environment of looking towards some sort of long-term peace. Cultural heritage, destruction versus respect. And I just want to say that as we talk about that, we need to really engage people who will talk about the value of cultural artifacts, obviously for their own intrinsic value as part of global patrimony. But at the same time, the way that inanimate objects that represent centuries of history and culture are treated is also going to be an indication of how people are going to be treated.
Yeah, well, in this case, we have actual people who are being treated pretty badly, so you don't really need any other confirmation from in terms of treatment of monuments. Yeah, but I remember traveling to Hadrut. Hadrut has a beautifully located old ruined monastery, Ktichalang, where I remember a bunch of graffiti with both Armenian and Azerbaijani names, so going back to the Soviet times. I doubt we will see that building preserved, or even preserved to the extent that it was preserved up until then.
Well, to the extent that it was preserved, yeah.
Yeah. So the only place that so far has been sort of protected is Dadivang, where the Russians are based. But it's a question of how permanent that is,
and the rest. So that too is an episode to come. Now, in addition to these, we have a whole other kind of set of discussions that are going to have to be held. One is Turkey's calculations. What was Turkey thinking coming into this? What is Turkey looking at now for its own national, hegemonic, imperial, neo-imperial, neo-Ottoman interests, as well as its relationships in the region, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Iran. We're going to have to look at thinking inside Russia and how not just Putin and Lavrov, but how everyone else is really looking at this. How is that going to go, that conversation?
The whole question about thinking in Russia, thinking in Turkey, thinking in Azerbaijan, thinking in Armenia. We need to realize that all four states are tyrannies where you have one decision maker in each, and they think about stuff, and everybody else is thinking about what they're thinking. So that's kind of the reality of these countries. There is not a process through which decisions are taken. You have a general lay of the land where you have sort of from non-controversial to the more controversial positions. But we just saw how Nikol Pashinyan went from Artsakh as Armenia to signing the November 10 agreement. We also can imagine changes in how Erdogan thinks about this. We can imagine Putin changing certain things about the Russian peacekeeping, deployment, etc. So problem is when you have countries like this where decisions are not vetted, decisions are not checked by any other political groups institutionally, it becomes very, very difficult to predict where things go, where they might end up.
Well, except that you're conflating policymaking and thinking, popular people level concerns, thoughts, demands. And our challenge is going to be to try to identify those two, the thinking of the elites and the thinking of the actual populations on the ground, given as difficult as it's going to be, I acknowledge. If we also look, obviously, inside Azerbaijan, what is happening there, inside Armenia, what is happening there, what we really don't hear about and read about is the impact of this new geopolitical reality in the region, its impact on Iran and its impact on Georgia. And I cannot imagine that either one of those countries' leaderships are not thinking about the changes that this means for them economically and security-wise.
Yeah, I think for Iran, there's definitely will be growing concern whether the Azerbaijani nationalism inside Iran will be affected, promoted as a result of this conflict, and whether, say, Azerbaijani nationalist focus will shift towards Iran. Like with everything else, they're hiding their concerns, and just saw Foreign Minister Zarif sort of congratulating Azerbaijan on recapturing its territory, etc. Georgia, there are probably a set of concerns having to do with Georgia maybe losing some of its role as the main transportation hub if the rail links indeed reopen between Armenia and Russia via Azerbaijan, or via Armenia between Azerbaijan and Turkey. Until now, Georgia's had sort of monopoly on those routes. So it might also push Georgian government Georgian leader to think about reopening the border with Abkhazia and justify that by saying, well, we got to reopen this now to be able to maintain our edge in terms of transportation.
The economic impact as well. The economic impact on Georgia and its geopolitical position, of course, have changed significantly. And Turkey by itself, and the discussion of Turkey within NATO, the fact that NATO's second biggest army was so cavalierly engaged in this bilateral conflict that became a regional conflict. And what does that say for Turkey's position in NATO? What does that say for NATO's responsibility around the world? And finally, because we're running out of time, the other thing that we will talk about is Russia in 5 years. This is an agreement for Russian peacekeepers to be present for 5 years. What does that mean in 5 years for Russia and obviously for Karabakh and Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, in terms of the West and sort of Turkey's role here, there were twofold concerns. On one hand, people are worried that Turkey might, shift its gears and confront some of the NATO members, EU members, as it has in the Mediterranean and with Greece more or less directly. At the same time, there was quite a bit of excitement that Russia was being challenged in the Caucasus, and there has been close to no concern over people getting killed in that area. It's just not hitting very few radars in the West. As far as the Russia in 5 years, that's the big question for Armenia, whether Russia will be able to persevere as a regional power, both because it's been challenged by Turkey, but also because it's being challenged by itself. I mean, we've had
Yes.
sort of recurrent history of Russia where, because again, the mechanisms for succession are not there, and you have one-man rule. How replacement of that rule what impact it will have on the policies, and historically it had a negative effect on the periphery of Russia. And one big issue that Armenians need to think about is whether its current status, Armenia as an independent state, how helpful it is for protection of the Armenian state, Armenian people in the state, and whether other forms of existence should be considered, because historically we know that over many years Armenia was colonized by other countries, and the only reason it's an independent state right now is because it was made a republic and was granted independence and win the independence. So that's something to keep in mind.
It is. I guess it's as good a place to end as any. The reality is that anybody who has looked at any maps and read any sort of history knows that this is a region where nothing is permanent. Borders certainly aren't permanent. The presence of imperial powers shifts significantly. And so even though we're looking at this list of, I don't know what we came up with, 15, 16 different topics that will have to be individually explored and dissected, that all of that really lives in the context also, not just of a history that always shifted, but a world that continues to shift. So thank you, Emil Sanamyan, and thank you all for listening, for following. Stay tuned. We're going to take each one of these apart one by one with scholars, with practitioners, and see what we can understand about this hugely complex situation that's going to have also very large impact on the domestic situation in all of the countries involved. Thank you for following the Institute of Armenian Studies at USC.